So I decided to kind of revisit this old project that I worked on a while ago called the online classroom. If you don't remember, I was working on a trpc next application. I guess you could say a T3 stack application where I was trying to make like an online classroom where you can come in as this teacher, create a classroom and have students join that classroom. And then they can upload assignments and submit files and stuff like that. And I will say I made some good progress, but I kind of let the project just sit idle for a little bit. And when you do that, you end up getting a lot of dependencies that kind of go out of date. So the question I want to kind of talk about is how often should you update dependencies? Now, from my experience, and every team might have a different perspective and every person might have a different perspective, but I think updating your dependencies as often as possible is probably the best solution, right? Because you want your stuff to be on the latest versions, not only to potentially fix little bugs that these maintainers of these third-party libraries find, but also there could be security vulnerabilities, and they have to release these little patches that fix these security vulnerabilities, and you want to make sure that you get those into your project. So going back to my commits, about 2 months ago, I was doing some good work on this, and then I kind of stopped. So 2 hours ago, I decided to upgrade trpc and next. So I was using trpc version 9, which did things a little bit different. Like if you look at the difference between how some of the router stuff works, I guess I can just give like a little walkthrough of like the difference between trpc 9 and 10. Although it's been 2 months, like I just haven't gotten around to messing with it. So it's always good to learn how to use your git diff tools so you can kind of look at files and how they changed over time. If you see here on the left, this is how the router used to be created. We call like a create router function, and then you can tack on a .middleware. And then everything after the middleware would basically enable that middleware and start using it, right? So we have like some authorization middleware that's going on. The change for trpc 10 is that now on your routes, you actually do a procedure.use and you pass in the middleware for every individual query and mutation. So I think this is a better approach. I like this a lot because I can kind of fine tune which mutation and query needs what middleware function directly. Instead of having to have this thing like precede all the ones that need it. It's kind of weird, or was kind of weird before. And then obviously this used to take in a key, like a string that used to describe the mutation or query name, followed by an options object that had an input and a resolve. So the change here is that they're doing some type of like kind of chaining, some method chaining, I guess, where you can do .input and you can chain on a .mutation or a .query after the input to kind of set up these endpoints in like what they do. Other than that, I mean, everything was pretty consistent. Like I didn't have to change anything inside the actual asynchronous callback functions of the mutations and queries. The object that you pass the input is the same. The only difference is that you no longer have like this string of a key. You actually pass it an object that is a key, and then the value would be procedure.use. So that's like the main change that I've seen from going from trpc 9 to 10, and I do like it. I do like this change a lot. So there were also some changes in the front end with like how you use trpc to use your queries and mutations. So if you see here on the left, we used to have a use query. You pass in an array that has the first thing being a key of that mutation or query we defined on the back end, and then you pass in the properties. I found this a little bit weird, to be honest, previously on trpc version 9, but with trpc version 10, I actually like this approach that we see over here, where basically you get the IntelliSense directly off your trpc object, right? So if I were to load up this classroom overview screen, if I do like a trpc dot whatever, like all my routers are merged together and I can have access to these directly. I don't have to like pass these weird string keys everywhere. Now I can just like say user.getUser.use query, and then I can use that query directly. So that's the main change with the front end things. Like you basically just chain on the properties that you want to use, and the IntelliSense is basically set up for you. Now, there were some other like boilerplate things I had to go around and like update when I did the trpc changes. And the best way to do this update, honestly, was I originally used create T3 stack or create T3 app to generate this project. So what I did is I went to the create T3 app repo and I kind of just looked through the files and tried to figure out like, okay, how did they set up their files to work with trpc 10? And I kind of just copied and pasted some things over, right? Like they might have had some upgrade guide published for how you can upgrade all your stuff from trpc 9 to 10. in next 12 to 13, but I basically just looked at the code and just figured some stuff out. So again, that whole overview of like, why am I talking about upgrading to trpc? Because when you don't touch a project for a while, your versions of packages and dependencies will start getting really outdated. And I've had it before where like I load up a project that's 2 years old, no one's touched any of the versions of anything, and then you try to run it and it just starts breaking. And you're like, okay, well maybe it's because I'm using like a super old version of something with a newer version of Node. And then you start trying to update things, and then everything just starts breaking, and it becomes almost impossible to get the app working because every package is like 3 versions or 4 versions behind what the current version is. You don't know what you can update, what you can't update, and it just becomes too unmanageable to even update anything, so you just leave it alone. I think that's like, in my opinion, one of the biggest arguments, that like every week you should be trying to update these dependencies, right? There's different ways you can do this. You can do an npm update, and that'll actually run through, and I believe it'll update the minor and patch versions of your packages, depending on what this caret is, or if you don't have a caret, or if you have like versions locked down. There's another application or tool I like to use called npm check updates. And when you run this, it'll actually go through your package JSON and try to figure out what packages are out of date, and it'll tell you. And if there's something that you need to update, you can just rerun it with the -u, and that'll update to all the latest packages. Now you have to make sure you test your code, because it's always risky updating these dependencies, right? You can update from version next 12 to 13, and then everything's going to break. And that's actually what we saw on this project. Even though only 2 months have gone by, there's a lot of major updates that happened between Next and trpc. And one of the main changes that kind of broke everything was the way that you use the link component. So if I go and look at a link component, previously you could put an a tag in here, right? But for whatever reason, Next 13 does not allow that and actually crashes. So I had a bunch of files that were just breaking because I was doing it the old approach, and I had to go through all my files and update that. So it was a pretty minor thing that broke. But just to exemplify that, like if you don't keep your stuff up to date, it becomes harder and harder and harder to keep that ball moving forward with your project. Now I'm not using any of the special stuff with Next 13. Like I'm not using the new beta version of stuff. I'm not going to touch that until like people use it for a long time. I'm going to stick to the old approach, the solid approach of keeping a source folder and a pages layout, which works fine. So I'm not saying that like just because a new version of something comes out, you have to use the new approach, but I would recommend updating if there's any beneficial security patches or bug fixes or just new features that you want to get with these libraries, then yeah, it's probably a good idea to update them. So that's kind of what I did tonight. Was I just went through this project. I wanted to update everything because I do plan to revisit this and make more live streaming / videos of me adding more features to this, right? I had it at a good state. People were able to upload files to S3, and people can download those files, and teachers could grade assignments. I got all that stuff set up, and then I kind of just stopped working on this project. I don't know why I stopped, but I want to kind of revive it. And I think if anyone who subscribed to my channel is watching this, I think it's beneficial to watch me build an actual real application instead of me just building these little one-off, small little tic-tac-toe projects that I don't think are that beneficial to learning the overall picture of web development and programming. So I'm curious, if you guys are on a team and you have your own projects that you're managing, like your own software projects at work, how often do you all update your dependencies? Do you do it every week? Do you do it every month? Do you allocate some time to make sure that all of your dependencies are the latest and greatest? Like when a new version of Node comes out, how quick do you switch over to that, or do you kind of wait? I do think there's a downside of being on the bleeding edge of all these new packages, because a lot of these new packages and versions do have bugs, and you don't want to be the first people to like encounter those bugs, because then you spend the entire day fixing the bugs instead of actually doing productive work. But on the other side of the spectrum, if you spend 2 years and you don't update anything, and you're still on the old version of like Angular JS, even though we're on Angular like 9 or 18, or I don't even know where we're at right now, it's always good to like make sure you allocate some time and talk to your project managers, talk to your product owners, and be like, look, there's a new version of Angular that came out. I think we should allocate 2 weeks or 2 sprints to migrate over to the new version of Angular, or try to find some type of migration plan to slowly change and refactor our code base. Because at some point, what happens is the project becomes so old and it's still using some old legacy software that gets deprecated. Like I think Angular JS is now deprecated. But I guarantee you there's projects out there still using AngularJS because they didn't take the time to refactor it to a newer version of Angular. Or there's probably still projects using the old class components of React. And at some point, I'm sure that's going to get deprecated too because everyone's using the functional component way of React. So take the time, update your crap, and then make sure, this is the key takeaway, make sure you have a lot of integration tests and end-to-end tests that verify that when you update these packages, your entire application doesn't break with very strange edge cases, right? If you're not doing any type of test coverage on your app, any type of integration test, it's going to be very hard to update, let's say, Lodash to a new version and not have that confidence that you didn't break everything in your application, right? So you need to have your stuff tested. And one good approach is just go ahead and update one package at a time. If you're on a legacy project and you have a bunch of old stuff, go by one, update it to the latest, see what happens, run your tests. If it passes, move on to the next version, update that, run your tests, and just kind of continue that process. It's going to be a tedious process, I know, but it's definitely a necessary process that you should start to follow so that your projects don't become a giant pile of steaming garbage that someone else down the road is going to have to take care of. But yeah, if you guys want to, continue on this online classroom project, this T3 app project, it was using like Prisma, it was using Postgres, started using some Amazon S3 for files. Be sure to stick around and keep those updates and notifications on so that you can see when I start working on this again. Anyway, hope this little talk was beneficial to you. Have a good day and happy coding.